In this episode of Shaping the Future, I am speaking with Adrian Tait, a founding member of the Climate Psychology Alliance, or the CPA. Adrian discusses how the linkages between events such as the US election and COVID-19 are compounding the anxiety that many people feel about the climate and ecological crisis. In particular, he discusses Through the Door, a CPA initiative that has been utilised to help create a space where people who share anxieties about climate and ecology can come together. These groups are self-sustaining and may well offer the foundations of psychological resilience needed in an ever more troubled time. One key observation is that the pandemic offers insights into how a society under pressure responds. In particular, Adrian highlights how necessary it is to discern the conflicting desires between a return to a pre-COVID world founded on unsustainable principles and the opportunity to recess our value systems and gear them towards a more balanced and sustainable environment. Thank you for listening to Shaping the Future. We have many more episodes covering climate science, psychology, policy, among the many complexities surrounding climate change. Please do subscribe on any of our channels to stay up to date. So Adrian, thank you very much for speaking to me today. It's been 4 years since we last had a proper long discussion, and I'd like to start this one by asking you to really define the Climate Psychology Alliance in the current context, because a lot has changed since we last spoke.
Well, if I may, I'd like to lead in with something at the level of feelings. I do feel an uncanny connection between this moment and the moment of our previous talk just over 4 years ago. And I think there is a sickening sense of anxiety around about the future, not exclusively, but very much hinging on the outcome of the forthcoming US election, and a real struggle for anybody who is committed to what I would see as any sense of social justice, but also obviously, particularly for environmental issues, the struggle to understand how a political or psychological culture which so excludes those values can have been so dominant and can even have the remotest chance of prevailing again. And I think that for me, that sense of apprehension and restless fear was greatly accentuated by something I read recently, in which Michael Mann, of all people, who has been critical, for instance, of David Wallace Wells's approach through his article and then book Uninhabitable Earth, and critical of Jem Bendel's venturing into the question of collapse in his deep adaptation paper and discussions, that even Michael Mann is saying that everything is at stake with that election, and that a Trump re-election would be utterly catastrophic. So I just wanted to start with that, because that to me is the mood of the moment, but widening the perspective a little and trying to directly address your question. Things have changed a great deal since our conversation 4 years ago, and the Climate Psychology Alliance, which was still in its infancy when we spoke then, has grown and developed a great deal. And that is largely, I think, because it starts with a whole sequence of messages from various quarters, including the Science, the last IPCC report, the publications that I mentioned, the escalation of extreme climate events from all around the world, which you don't need me to enumerate, and the social phenomena, most notably Greta Thunberg and the school strikers. Also, of course, Extinction Rebellion, which have been forcing climate awareness upon us, even those who are reluctant to take it on board. I think accompanying that, there's been an increasing interest in the psychological dimension of this vast and complex subject, starting with why it is that humankind generally has made such a hash of taking the situation on board and responding appropriately to it. So that's the backdrop. And then I think we'll want to talk a bit about the particular ways in which the Climate Psychology Alliance, CPA, has developed and changed its emphasis in response to what we see as the most pressing needs of this time.
Okay, and you certainly mentioned XR, the Extinction Rebellion, and the school strikers, which is very much getting into the activist mindset. It's getting into the societal mindset, because those groups are made up of parents, grandparents, are made up of workers, people who are trying to express to others how they feel and basically what they want. Can you talk a little bit about what the symptoms that they experience that make the Climate Psychology Alliance respond to, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, one thought I have about that is that those signs of eco or climate distress are varied and in some cases quite contrasting. To give you an example, the difficulty that the climate activist might bring to one of my colleagues could be in the area of activist burnout. That people are choosing to put themselves, in the front line of the anxiety of our times. And putting themselves in danger as well as official reactions become less tolerant, in some cases quite brutal. Both the backdrop and the risks that activists subject themselves to by getting there on the front line are, I would say, great stressors. So there's that. But there's a very contrasting and much more, I would say, generalized difficulty that we're encountering, which is that people who have chosen, if I can put it like that, to open their minds to the severity of the climate and ecological emergency that we're facing. Once they cross that threshold, I mean, there may be a step back that some people take, but assuming they get to somewhere that then becomes a fixture in their minds, there's a common experience of coming up against what is still the prevailing tendency in our culture, which is to find ways of dismissing or forgetting about the problem, to not, I think, in most cases now outright denial, but ways of carrying on with life as normal as much as possible in the current times, as if these emergencies did not exist. And I think that can be disorientating and alienating to people who have engaged with the problem. Can lead to difficulties within families, within social groups, and so on. We all know that human beings like to feel that they have a secure place within their peer group, the people they love and care about. And it can disrupt all of that. So that feeling of alienation or isolation and all the anxieties and fears that go with it is a very common experience. And alongside that, people are struggling to find ways of communicating with others who are not in the same place as them, so that it doesn't just become a non-subject, but finding a way to communicate that keeps the subject open, but somehow accommodates these very different positions that people are taking.
Okay, on the subject of activist burnout, is that something that can be prevented? Because I'm guessing that one of the problems there is an individual throws themselves at the purpose and the cause, becomes exhausted, but the cause remains, and then it leads to this sort of even worse situation. Can you talk about how the CPA would approach this kind of thing?
Well, in a way, it's the other way around. We've been approached by, for instance, the Deep Adaptation Organization and Extinction Rebellion to ask if we can help with therapeutic inputs. And that in a way it's been a long time coming, but it is an eventual fulfillment of something that was there in CPA's aims from the very word go. We're not by any means all of us therapists or counselors, but quite a few of us are. And there's always been a searching for the best way in which we can use our resources, our experience, and so on, to benefit the largest possible number of people. I think there was something quite fortuitous. I think we were ready when we were approached by Jen Bendel at Deep Adaptation and were told that a lot of people were expressing disturbance as well as some degree of relief that the prospect or possibility of collapse was being talked about. So it sort of released a whole lot of things which could help them to go on feeling safe enough to keep going. Yeah, CPA was ready for that. So that led to a fairly rapid response, which included this program that we call Through the Door, which is designed to help and enable people with therapeutic interests and backgrounds to engage in this somewhat specialized as well as diverse field.
Can you break down for us how you'd approach this whole subject from a psychotherapy point of view?
Well, I think breakdown is absolutely the right phrase to use in that question, because in a way what has to be broken down is some of the traditional mindset of the therapist in the consulting room, and to put it rather crudely, the sort of me doctor, you patient dynamic. Because I think the first thing which a therapist or counsellor has to do in order to have a chance of being useful in this field is to fully embrace the reality that we are all in this together. We're all, for instance, struggling with the conflicts arising from the fact that we're all beneficiaries of the fossil fuel age, and we're all liable to feel guilty about that at the same time. So we have to go through our own new process of self-awareness and preparation, as well as developing a flexibility with regard to the situations at an individual or group level, an organizational level, in which we may find ourselves if we're offering ourselves to work in a therapeutically informed way in this field.
Okay, and can you give an example, almost like a case study of how that's played out with people from deep adaptation or Extinction Rebellion?
It would be most appropriate for me to use my own example of my own experience, although I've had quite a strong and have ongoingly quite a strong connection with deep adaptation. The applied therapeutic work that I've done hasn't been with either of those organisations. It was in Somerset with a colleague, with a group formed from a green network, and it happened very soon after I did the Through the Door experiential workshop. And I got this approach asking me if I could facilitate some sort of process for members. I approached a female colleague to co-facilitate this. We set up 6 meetings for these people, and it was to some extent experimental, but what my colleague and I very quickly realized was that we didn't have to do very much at all by way of structuring or providing material for people to work with. What we had to do, and I know this could easily sound like therapist speak, was provide a safe space in which people had permission and felt relaxed enough with us and with each other to talk about, for instance, their fears as parents, and most of these people were parents, about the future facing their children, which is it's a huge issue at the moment. And the group went very well. One of the most rewarding things about it was that although these people were already part of a network, the participants in the group gradually started to form a set of quite strong linkages with each other. And so my co-facilitator and I, we obviously didn't solve anything for these people, nor did we set out to do so. But we felt that something had been solved because the sense that each of these participants had in being part of a network of people all grappling with similar problems, that had a really strong beneficial effect on their well-being, and that felt very rewarding.
I think, as you described it, it's quite self-explanatory in terms of the outcome. Became a self-supporting unit in a way.
It really felt like it had been an antidote to some of the doubts and feelings of being odd and am I exaggerating, am I worrying about this too much? All those doubts and questions that people had tended to go through. It gave them a greater sense of validity and companionship in their ongoing struggles with this subject.
Surely this must be a personal crisis for many people all over the country and beyond. Are these approaches taking place around the country?
Very much so. And one of the features of CPA's growth and development in the last 4 years or so is that our membership has strengthened and deepened internationally. We've got some very, very active colleagues in the USA who are within the different context of that culture, but pursuing very similar courses. And at the same time, we're enriching each other. We in the UK, where CPA started, are experiencing a sort of mutual enrichment and support, and some very interesting sort of comparative conversations, about different challenges in different countries. Can I make a move in the direction of making sure we don't leave another elephant in the room, which is COVID-19?
This whole series is called From Pandemic to Climate Change. So if you can shed light on how you see these parallels.
Well, I mean, CPA would require me to mention it anyway, because the Through the Door program quite explicitly is set up to acknowledge and respond to the effects that the pandemic is having on people, as well as the ongoing ecological and climate emergency that we're facing. And I've given the juxtaposition a certain amount of thought, and I've written about it. And I think the first thing to be said is, I suspect the majority of people still don't acknowledge or recognize this, is that both those two emergencies and the pandemic are the direct consequences of a lack of awareness in humankind's collective way of operating in the context of the greater than human world. A man called David Quammen, who gave a very, very good interview some months back, his way of putting it was that our collective intrusiveness into formerly untrammeled environments is pulling viruses towards us. So there's that link in terms of the broad picture of Earth systems, and I think that's really important. But in a way, more pressingly, I think what we need to observe and understand and find ways of responding to is that although the long-term and Earth system consequences of COVID-19 are probably minuscule compared with the climate and ecological disruptions that we've set in motion, looking at it more broadly. You could say there's a sort of experiment going on. What do we do? How do we react? How do we respond? Are we willing to try to learn from a situation in which our sense of security and entitlement has taken a hit, to put it rather mildly? Our freedom to operate in the way that we're used to operating has taken a big hit. That there are voices saying that, in fact, one of your previous interviewees, Rupert Reed, made this very point, that the pandemic is an opportunity for us to wake up to this broad crisis, and it's also an opportunity for us to make changes in the direction of a more sustainable collective way of operating economically and so on. The evidence that we're doing that is pretty scant and pretty patchy, but it's a really important point. The split, the dichotomies that we can see in people's responses to these various crises is just so evident here. We see a whole kind of spectrum of reactions being evoked and being provoked and encouraged, I think, from certain quarters, including profound resentment and paranoia. So that there are, I think, quite a lot of, I would say, probably deliberate forces that are pushing us back towards the way we have been operating in the past is normal and healthy and right, and we need to get back there as soon as possible, in direct opposition to those voices which are saying, hang on, there are some really important lessons to be learned here. And okay. I just would like to add something else, which is that when I said earlier about the long-term Earth system impacts of COVID-19 being minuscule compared with what we're doing to the climate and the wider ecosystem, that was in no way intended to minimize the suffering and the distress arising from confusion and so on as a result of this disruption. I just wanted to correct myself there.
That's fine, of course. Given this sense that we know we need to change in the light of COVID related to the climate and in greater ecological problems, there's this sense of powerlessness of the situation, because the COVID is causing all kinds of different responses in people from all kinds of sources of emotions. But also, how do we regain the strength for staying tuned in and staying rational and also clearly articulating what we want as individuals, but also as a society?
Well, one thing we have to, I think, be careful to do is not to overburden ourselves with responsibilities that feel impossible. But I think within CPA, we have a sense of being able to make a contribution towards a process which is, sadly still countercultural, to foster or contribute to the possibility for people of feeling linked to others in their response to the problem. And I think that's not to be underestimated. And we don't call ourselves the Climate Psychology Alliance for nothing. From the word go, we've sought out alliances and sought to foster and nurture cooperation between groups that may be, culturally quite disparate, but which have a common cause.
Okay, that's a very good place for us to press pause for the moment. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating.
It's good to talk to you, Nick.
Brilliant.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Pleasure.